Hello, everyone. This is your host, Philip Reiner. I wanted to welcome you to The Fourth Leg. This is a series of podcasts focused on one of the most complex systems in the world today, nuclear command and control, and its increasingly complicated future. Within this series, we're going to go straight to the experts across multiple sectors to talk about the modernization of nuclear command and control systems. Keep an eye on technology for global security in the coming weeks and months as we begin to launch additional podcast series focused on how to fix the internet, AI and global security, and other critical technology and security related issues. For now, we have so much to talk about. Let's get started. For today's podcast, we are joined by our colleague Peter Hayes from the Nautilus Institute. We spoke with Rear Admiral John Gower, who served until his retirement in December of 2014 as the Assistant Chief of Defense Staff for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Programs in the UK Ministry of Defense. Previous to that role, Admiral Gower had a 36-year-long military career, half of which was actually undertaken at sea, which culminated in the sequential command of 2 globally deployed submarines. He's someone who comes to this set of issues with a depth and breadth of expertise that really is difficult to find. Someone who really knows quite a bit about nuclear command control, not just from a theoretical perspective, but from a practical hands-on perspective. So, John, thank you again for making the time to join us for this conversation here today. One of the things that we want to try and do with these conversations that are more, when it comes to NC3, that are more country profile in orientation, is just to take a step back at the beginning. And based off the conversations that we've had with you, the discussions at the workshop back in January, but most importantly, based off of the paper that you submitted, it really is, it's a unique NC3 profile when it comes to the UK. And so if we could, just by way of the basics, ask for your perspective on just what are the foundations of how the UK approaches NC3 today and how it thinks about command and control more generally when it comes to our nuclear weapons.
The first thing I need to say is that clearly what I say is my personal opinion. It's informed by the years that I spent in the government, but nothing that I say should be construed or inferred to be the position of the UK government. And with that sort of precursor, we are unique in the UK, and I'll use we because it gets really difficult to keep saying the UK and not me. We are unique in the UK because we have a single system. And apart from the so-called Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, that there's no other nuclear weapon state that has any kind of openness on its systems that has a single system. And so that drives a very different viewpoint about how you need to configure and manage command and control for that system. Having said that, our system is also legacy, or our command and control has legacies from the entire history of the nuclear weapons state that is the United Kingdom. And during that time, we've had weapons in the air, both maritime and air force, and we've had weapons on board ships, as well as in the latter stages of that time, strategic missiles in submarines. And so, whilst there are no systemic bits of kit, if you like, that hanker back, there are some hangovers in the way in which we do things that came, their genesis was the rather more hectic and frenetically interpreted position that the nuclear weapon states were during the period known as the Cold War. So, although we are different and unique, I think we have that we're in the same ballpark as the United States, Russia, France, and China when looking at legacy holdovers of the way in which the system is set up. And so we have a single system, an SSBN, a ballistic missile submarine carrying Trident strategic ballistic missiles with United Kingdom warheads on board, of which we have one continuously at sea. And so the fact that it is a continuously at sea deployed deterrent means that it drives the way in which we command and control it in a different way from systems that are designed to cope with aircraft or ICBMs or other systems that are not deployed continuously in the same way. So I'm not going to read the paper out, but I will refer to things in it. And so there are sort of the three bits in the paper that really are important. Firstly, the nature of our deterrent drives the nuclear command and control system we have, which is sort of a little bit of repetition of my introduction. Secondly, the way in which the elements that we place within our command and control, physical elements. And then the third part of it is the human elements that use the physical elements to exercise control. And it's very important to remember throughout all of this that there is nothing automatic in the UK system that either initiates or prevents anything from happening. So any initiation or prevention is a human interaction at the political level, and there is no means by which a machine will either stop a step or take a step. All the machines do are exercise and transmit human messages and human commands through the system. And that's quite an important point because that is another area in which the UK differs. So, for instance, other systems have, if you like, air gap links, permissive action links, things which require a specific change in configuration to a system to allow something to happen. That is not the case in the UK. And I can explain as we go through this why that is. Some of it is historic, but the other is relating to the nature of our deterrent. So I'll start with talking about a little bit more about what I meant by a continuously patrolling SSBN carrying Trident. We've had this mission since 1968 and continuously since the year following that. And initially they were at very high readiness to launch. They can be held at high readiness to launch at any stage, but as the government makes it clear today, our submarines are at several days' notice to fire, which in nuclear weapon historic terms is very long, and are not targeted on anything. So the system as it sits today is probably the most relaxed, if that's the right phrase, that UK nuclear weapons have ever been. However, in order to maintain the capability and the credibility of the deterrent, successive UK governments have continued to endorse the decision originally made in the mid 60s that these submarines would patrol continuously. And so the command and control system must be able to communicate as continuously as the submarine desires it to communicate with it. So if the submarine's at several days' notice to fire, clearly it doesn't need to talk to or listen to the command and control system every minute of every day. If it's a very high readiness to fire, clearly it needs to be able to listen to it at every single day. So so the system must be able to cope with those two dynamics. And the systems on board the submarine must be able to cope with these two dynamics. So, in the event that the submarine status needs to change, either during a crisis or whether a launch needs to be conducted, the nuclear command and control systems and the communication bearers that are related to those must be able to transmit that information from the National Command Authority, which is vested normally in the body of the Prime Minister, to the SSBNCO in all stages of crisis and in war. And it can do that without any knowledge being extracted by somebody else that these things are being changed. Of course, it's always in the political remit to make public anything they choose to do, but they have the option, which is not necessarily the case with manned aircraft, for instance. They have the option to disguise the fact that they're either raising or lowering the readiness. And again, that's another contributory factor of the SSBN to the UK's posture. I'd now sort of like to move over to the characteristics of our communication system and why perhaps they differ from others and why we've set it up the way that we have. So essentially, I lay out and I've characterized a nuclear command, control, and communication system, which I shall say for now on as NC3, there are basically four elements. You must be able to pass an ability to correctly, unambiguously, and against all chances of error, to identify that the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister or the decision maker is the decision maker at the beginning of the chain, and that you can pass a correctly formatted instruction message, whether it be a change posture or a firing message, all the way through the elements of human interaction in the communication chain between the command authority and the SSBN itself. In order to support that ability to authenticate, transmit, and receive with proper authentication all the way through, you also need an architecture that has no single point of failure. So there is no node which, if it catches fire, blows up, is switched off, or whatever, will generate a stop in that system, because otherwise you don't have a system. And nor can the system generate a firing message any other way than being generated by the command authority. And in order to do that, you have to have an invulnerable encryption system as part of that. I've alluded to this, but the system must have multiple possible and preferably simultaneous transmission paths across the radio spectrum, everything from high frequency to the lowest of frequencies, in order to ensure that in all foreseeable circumstances, including a nuclear confrontation having already been initiated, that message will get through. In order to deter, therefore, the system must be able to operate even if the country, the UK, has been in receipt of a nuclear strike. And so the architecture that falls out from that is multiple, manifoldly multiple, and capable of delivering that redundancy. And I regret, well, I don't regret, but I'm going to be unable to go into any more detail as to what that architecture is. But suffice to say, it fulfills those criteria that I've just laid out. Now, there's nothing specifically unique in the United Kingdom for that, with the single exception that because we only have a single system, and because we are a small nation physically, from a destructive point of view, if you're looking to destroy her, we are not able to rely on a second or third separate retaliation system to deter, and we're not able to necessarily rely that our command and control system will totally survive a absolutely devastating attack. And so we have had, since the SSBNs came in, and which was classified until 2009, a system known as the last resort. Your question also included the sort of approach to command and control, and I think what I will say there is that another unique aspect of the United Kingdom is that we have, as far as it is possible, with a system that is actually manned by military personnel, we have removed senior military personnel from the decision making in regards to the decision about whether to launch a nuclear attack or not. And that is very different. Although the decision making rests specifically in the USA and France with the president in the same way as it does with the prime minister in the United Kingdom, to my specific knowledge, there is very close involvement of very senior military personnel in both of those countries in the discussions around the decision. In the United Kingdom, we have moved away from that, and we have placed the most senior military voice, which was the job that I did, in the process that moves to a decision. In other words, providing the briefings, the information necessary to the political leadership for that to make its decision. My role was solely constrained in crisis and in conflict to expressing boundaries, physical boundaries of the system. So it was, what can we do? So I'm sorry, that's not possible, or that is possible, or if asked the question, what is possible, that can be answered. But whether that is a political question as far as the UK is concerned. And I think we differ in the scale of involvement of the military mindset in that execution decision from, I would suspect, all other nuclear weapon states. Because if you set France, the UK, and the US to one side, every other nuclear weapon capable state, whether it's recognized or not, either is completely military controlled, or there is an even greater involvement of the military in their everyday political military decisions, let alone launch of a nuclear weapon. You shouldn't conflate non-military with political leadership. There's another layer of leadership that's engaged here, and in fact, the majority of the process, of course, we've never tested it for real, and therefore you would have to guess at what stage the political leaders, the secretaries of state, and the prime minister would get engaged. But in the peacetime exercising and management of this process, it is the most senior civil servants of the key departments, the Ministry of Defence, the Cabinet Office, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, who are the voices who then brief the political leadership. So the process is envisaged is you have a committee meeting that is essentially the heads of those head civil servants in those departments, who would gather, and that is the position at which the person executing my role would sit. It's then situation dependent as to whether a lowly two-star officer would be carded at some point and not involved, or taken all the way up to the top. It would be entirely dependent on the role. But at some point, those senior civil servants will engage with the politicians, the secretaries of state, foreign secretary and defense secretary, and the cabinet secretary, and then or the minister for the cabinet office, and then they would involve the prime minister. So there's a sort of pyramidal view. Now, the prime minister always has recourse, as does the chief of defense staff, to a direct contact on any military political issues. That's one of the whole. But the point is that in looking at the complexity of the problem, that the advice that's bubbling up through the senior civil servants to the ministers, to the prime minister, there is not a role in the UK for the most senior officers, who may or may not, depending on their background, be familiar enough with the nuances of nuclear deterrence, particularly the management of it in crisis. Because remember that the UK is fundamentally a state of deterrence, not a state of ambition in terms of nuclear gaining advantage in crisis or conflict through nuclear weapons. And so because of that, we don't have senior officers who are involved in these things from day to day. They've got much other things to do. So the purpose of it is to avoid that conventional operational military mindset suddenly leaping in to a crisis which it is not necessarily best prepared for, and exerting undue influence on the process. The process is run by people who think about this every month.
Well, I think in the United States, just to sort of focus on this for a moment, because I think it's quite both fascinating but really important to understand the differences here. And Philip, help me if I misspeak, but the presumption has been until this administration, historically, that the President of the United States would always, at minimum, be informed and consult with his senior or her senior, it's always been a he, military advisor, now the head of strategic command, before launching a nuclear strike. But that was purely a conventional assumption, not actually required. He may or may not have been in touch with the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the Secretary of Defense. But the fact of the matter was, legally, constitutionally, he can simply launch a nuclear strike without consulting anyone. And away you would go, off to the races. I suspect conventionally the system, the norms and the behaviors in the British system are quite different. This multi-layered pyramidal structure, that it would be inconceivable that a prime minister would exercise their prerogative to simply launch a nuclear strike without civilian or through those civilian layers, military advice informing the decision. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, I think you're correct in that it's inconceivable, but it is not impossible. There's no barrier to that happening. And I think you have to go back to, and it's worthwhile, and I'm well aware of the US systems, and there are strengths and weaknesses in both. But you go back to 1959, 1960, and Commander-in-Chief Bomber Command had release authority if simply he believed that the communication system could not cope with getting the Prime Minister's message to respond, bearing in mind, firstly, that they were living in a time when the decision loop was considered to be 4 minutes or fewer. And we know that the US and indeed NATO delegated nuclear release at the less than strategic level regularly to subordinate commanders. So I think that what the UK has done is to not, firstly, it moved away from that quite swiftly after the transfer from Bomber Command to the SSBNs in terms of holding our strategic deterrent. But this has not been a sort of a massive step change in the last 5 years. It's been part of an evolutionary process which has moved the UK mentally away, totally mentally away, from a structure that can not only support deterrence related nuclear command and control, but warfighting related nuclear command and control. And the structures that you end up with are a reflection, whether they're articulated or not, of how much of both of those you think you're going to be doing. So if you look at the UK command and control and who had release authority back in the 60s and 70s, it was much more complex, it was much more layered, and there were opportunities to delegate the launch authority outside of the National Command Authority, and the architecture that was then present reflected that. All of that has been swept away in the UK now. It has not been, for obvious reasons, in countries that exercise have different views about the utility of nuclear weapons across a broader spectrum. Because if you have to suddenly insert nuclear weapon launch authority into the order of battle for an air battle, so if you look at NATO's dual capable aircraft, they would have to, if used, they would have to operate within an air tasking organization, an air tasking authority that was doing all sorts of things, conventional and nuclear, in the combat area. Therefore, your command and control of those particular aircraft and the weapons in there must be able to integrate itself with a very complicated conventional air tasking order system, move aircraft around on the battlefield over a period of days and maybe even weeks, where the crisis, the conflict comes up and goes down or whatever it is. That's a very different problem set. So you end up with a very different need.
One of the things that we've been talking to a great extent about internally, but also with folks who have been contributing to this overall project, is something that you alluded to, is this question of invulnerability, of the necessary signals from nuclear commanders to operators. This is something that, if you'll recall back, that Eric Gross, who did a podcast with us a few weeks ago and submitted a paper about this as well for the workshop, but speaking with him about what is necessary in the 21st century to try and actually create something that is invulnerable, something that is actually an unbreakable, secure communications capability. I wonder to what extent your thinking has perhaps shifted in light of some of the modern day vulnerabilities that may be inherent to these systems. I mean, you noted at the outset that while things may have shifted to a single platform, you're still dealing with a lot of the legacy systems that have been in place for quite some time. That may obviate some of the concerns when it comes to things like cyber, but these things are always being upgraded. They're always being modernized. They're always being integrated with new techniques. So I was just curious from your perspective, how you think about, from the UK vantage, how these things are going to impact that invulnerability that you're talking about, that's necessary in order to present a credible deterrent.
I mean, there is a danger here of using invulnerability to mean different things. And I had this conversation with Eric over supper at the end of our time together, that when I talk and express the UK view of invulnerability, it's not through the lens necessarily, but it encompasses the lens that Eric's history has made him think about it. So he's thinking much more about security and vulnerability than physical vulnerability in the discussions I had with him. Now, I haven't heard his podcast or read his paper that has come out subsequent to which you referred, but first and foremost, when you are designing a multi-path system, that's predominantly so that in all circumstances, including direct attempts to sabotage your ability to do that, you have taken your system to be as near invulnerable as possible to prevention of transmission and reception. So the first problem is, can you ensure that whatever you transmit will get to the ballistic missile submarine? And you do that by saying, well, I can't, it is extremely difficult to have that assurance of invulnerability if you buy or if you produce a simple system, a single path system. It doesn't matter how much clever technology you wrap around that simple system, there will be physical
Mm.
nodes that could have bombs attached to them that when that's blown up, it doesn't work. And the internet has equal nodes. There are several places in the world where if you were to put a disruptive bomb, and they're largely either where communications cables come out of the ocean or where server farms are or data farms, you could
Mm.
basically take most of our what we now consider to be the internet down for a period. So you've got to do it by having, when you're looking at this problem, you've got to do it by having a multiplicity of paths that use every potential frequency range in the spectrum and different physical locations and systems that you transmit on in parallel, accepting that even in the normal course of events, one might break down even under no
Yep.
strain at all.
Yep.
But because things break, it happens. And so you have to have that in normal peacetime, because if you are constructing a communication system to a military capability, and particularly if you've decided to contract that out, as many are in the world today, you will have a service agreement that says, and even if you don't contract it out, service agreements exist intra the armed services in most nations these days. It's where one part of the armed service is contracted, if you like, to another part to deliver a certain degree of capability. In other words, 95%, because 99% is too expensive for the nation to. So I would say almost uniquely, if not uniquely, in certainly the UK military, you're looking for 100% service provision through the most demanding system. So when I talk about, so that's the first layer of invulnerability, the physical capability to get a signal from A to B
Mm.
through multiple, or A to Z probably, through multiple letter nodes all the way through. And then overlapped on top of that are the two, if you like, content vulnerabilities. So that's a physical transmission vulnerability that you have to solve. And then you've got two content vulnerabilities. The first one is, what is the message? Is it the message you want to transmit? Is it uncorrupted by the time it gets there? Does the message reflect? And the second one is, who's sending the message and who's receiving it? So the identity vulnerability. So you've got to solve the physical transmission vulnerability, the
Mm.
content vulnerability, and the identity vulnerability. And those are three very different things. Now, I know that Eric is fond of saying that there's probably a modern systemic way to achieve all of those three. And provided it can be proven to do so under all circumstances, then ultimately downstream it may become the bearer. But actually, in many ways, when looking at this particular problem,
Mhm.
because the data set that you're sending is very simple, this is not complex. It doesn't require the bandwidth we
Mm.
require to have this interview. It hardly requires any bandwidth at all. It's a very simple message you're sending, in the sense of the UK's requirement to give a launch order to an SSBN. So it doesn't need it's sort of like building a website for the very first internet in the 80s. When you
Yeah,
had
yeah, yeah.
14.4 MBS, whatever that is. Anyway, so your brrr of your modem would go up, and you didn't even think about sending pictures or music or video. Just getting your email,
Yeah.
hello
Yeah.
A, it's B. It was really at the sort of Alexander Graham Bell end of the telephone era. That's the kind of data you're looking to send today and into the future. So you don't need high bandwidth. What you need is high reliability, very high reliability. Because this message isn't going to change, because you're not trying to do a complicated thing like insert a nuclear powered capable aircraft into an tasking order, or trying to fight with a reactive, you're either going to launch or you're not, and you've just got to say what the launch is. That's actually a fairly simple thing to do. And so, although I'm constantly asked the question, well, eventually, you'll have to achieve IP
Mm.
capable communication. My question to that is simply why. There really is no driver from the need, whereas in every other sense, whether it be commerce, business, or military, the demand is
Yep.
inescapable for ever and ever greater and greater bandwidth, because of the desire to have the entire world in front of you on video screens or whatever it is, in that you can't now fight an infantry battle without having drones with video available to you, with an overhead raptors or whatever getting. This is not the warfare complexity that you're dealing with here. So there isn't this insatiable desire to deliver it through systems which then have other vulnerabilities in terms of identity vulnerability and content vulnerability. And those two vulnerabilities have really only come in. There was a certain, I mean, we're involved in it in the Second World
Yep.
War. We used Glaswegians and Liverpudlians. You used Navajo Indians. There was a certain amount of content vulnerability protection there. And then we invented scrambler phones, and we could encrypt this sort of stuff. But where that has got, the direction all of that has
Yep.
gone down the sort of the people who sit in Maryland and other places. It's not necessary in this specific requirement that the UK sets. You don't need to have, so you can focus, because you don't need to go down technology paths that bring with them a whole series of other pitfalls and problems. You don't go down those paths, and you seek paths that are separate from them.
I think the piece of it that starts to strain my own intellectual foundations in terms of my understanding of how these things actually work from the bottom up is the argument will be made, whether it's you're talking to somebody in Maryland or elsewhere, that the encryption capability is such that, at least pre quantum breakthroughs, the encryption capabilities are such that one can rely on the ability to actually transmit that information, and it will not be at risk, and you can trust what it is, and you can trust who it's from. But what you'd started to talk about a little bit, which is the core of an issue that we've been grappling with, trying to figure out how to help try to solve the problem, is everything around it, which is what you started talking about, and building those things up. And from the very core of it, whether it's the root kits, what some folks at some of the companies that we talk to think about a lot is core boot. And what they're finding is that throughout all of these systems, as the adversary gets more and more agile, is being able to get into the code that's in the chipsets, that's down inside these things, to an extent that even if you've got in encryption, the boxes and everything surrounding it, in order to actually serve as the beginning point and end point, are so easily penetrable. And I think that's one of the things that I was starting to allude to in my question about the quote unquote cyber element of this, is how does that begin to impact the thinking of those who are thinking about a 21st century architecture. I know how people here are thinking about it. I know quite a bit less about how folks perhaps in the UK are trying to wrap their heads around how to get ahead of that problem. And that's the conversation that we've been having with Eric, is how do you actually engender that piece of it? And I think that's honestly a question that remains to be answered. How do you actually secure those pieces of it? The Indian encryption piece of it, for at least the time being, is there. It's everything else that comes with it that is just, it the word invulnerable just can't be applied.
To answer your point, is that the architecture that you choose, that you select, either solves or brings problems. And the
Mm-hmm.
problem that you were alluded to the problems you allude to are much of them brought by the architecture, the modern architecture. So as soon as you use the word chipset, you have identified that you are doing this through a computerized, possibly online connected system, which allows you for vulnerabilities. And an analogy I'd use is that with the railway system in the UK is very much a 19th century architecture, but it's conducting 21st century business because no one has really decided that or found a better way to do that. So I think, and if we were to do a different thing, go to maglev or some other way of moving people around, a whole new set of problems come along.
Yeah.
So I think that analogy holds still. And if you are not trying to integrate your nuclear command and control and communications into your warfighting, conventional, normal daily life command and control and communications, then those problems to a certain extent, don't ever arise.
Yeah.
Because you don't need to go down those technological solutions, and therefore you don't need to come up with clever ways to combat the risks that come. The more people you want to be in your networked world, whether it be political military or military, the easier it is for someone who wants to get into your network, the easier it is for them to find a way in.
Yeah.
If you don't have a networked world, if you simply have a multi-strand point-to-point system, which is essentially what SSBN command and control is, you don't need to open your system up to these vulnerabilities.
John, I did ask you earlier about any thoughts you had on soft, or what you call soft or hard law or norms or mutual learning or information exchange, generally arms control measures that might be in the modern era potentially useful and between NC3 operators, whether communication over, for example, interpretation of data sets of potential nuclear attack, that it would be advantageous that everyone have some access to a mutual understanding of how you interpret data sets of, say, thermal signature of missile liftoffs, or how to read radar, or even the ability to check in with each other early on rather than in the midst of a crisis as to whether a particular sensed signal is real or not. Do you have any sense of whether such cooperation measures, whether they're just simple communication, actual cooperation, or even collaboration, might be useful between NC3 operators? There are at least 14 on the planet at this point with specific nuclear weapons postures associated with their decision making and communication systems.
Well, I would say there's 9 that matter, because the dual capable aircraft countries, whoever they are, can make all the decisions they like. If the US doesn't release the weapon, it's just an aircraft. So the decision makers who release weapons, there are 9 of them currently and this is all activity that is independent of NC3. This is activity controlled by the discussions authorized under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it was the P5 dialogue, which is mandated under the review conference and the preparatory conference, and other work that I'm involved in at the moment is about how that dialogue on risk reduction measures, which are all to do with openness, transparency, mutual understanding. There's a lot of foundation work even to get the road built, let alone putting the blacktop on, to get to a position where you are having discussions between those nations and the other 4 nuclear capable states or nuclear armed states about the value of dialogue in crisis and all of that kind of thing. At the moment, it's still, as I say, the sort of ground base rock level where you're trying to get everyone to be equally transparent about what weapons they have, what notice they're on, where they are, and what do you mean by weapon, and how do you define a warhead, and all of the things that the strategic arms control discussions between the Soviet Union, now Russia, and the US went into huge lengths to define what it is they meant. So, a bomber counts the same as how do you equate strategic bombers with ICBMs? And these required agreed definitions that took years and in some cases decades to negotiate. When you expand that beyond those 2 nuclear weapon states to the so-called P5, or indeed the 9, you're at a much more basic level. But fundamentally, that activity has to go on and to expand, because only when you have a joint openness and transparency, and the lack of transparency confuses me, because I believe in deterrence terms you can be thoroughly transparent about what you have, and in fact that aids deterrence. My concern is if you're starting to be less than transparent, you're probably thinking about other things other than deterrence. But that activity is ongoing and receiving as much dynamic push as it can from the MPT related activity, the action plans, and as I say, work that I'm doing with several governments and NTI and a few other organizations is about this, what you might call dynamic risk reduction. But none of them really is relating to the physical nature of command and control systems. But I will just link the 2 points by making a point that I think I made in January, is that there are things that can be done. I've talked about ambiguity and the role that plays, both on the one part in deterrence and on the other part in risk. But there's also ways in which you could arguably publicly look at the decision-making processes within your country, if you are a nuclear armed state, to show that you have an appropriate level of restraint, that you can show non-nuclear weapon states, or indeed potential adversary nuclear weapon states, and indeed allied nuclear weapon states, that you're if you use a sort of trigger analogy, that you're well away from it with all parts of your body. And so you could, a practical purpose, I've pushed this in public before, so I'll say it again. Let's take the UK. At the moment, the UK decision to launch a nuclear weapon is held in the Prime Minister's hands. And that is right and proper, because it is an elected representative who can be, depending on the party, the mechanism is different, but essentially at the parliamentary level can be deposed through the will of the people. So it is right and proper that that's where that decision is held. And at the moment, our structure is devised around an individual. Now, I wouldn't want to change that and saying that it becomes a committee, or it becomes 6 individuals, or indeed you allow multiple individuals to make independent. Those would not be positive to stability or risk. But you could say that constitutionally the United Kingdom would not consider, the Prime Minister would not consider that decision until there was an agreement between, say, 3 ministers, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, and the Defence Secretary, that the situation demanded such a decision. So you put in a deliberate decision to employ a nuclear weapon, you put a break of restraint in process, public process. Because much less likely that 3 people will agree in a democracy than 1 agrees with itself. Now, that wouldn't necessarily really achieve physically anything, but it would be a signal about the way in which the country views its nuclear weapons. In my view, it doesn't deter deterrence, because you'd make it equally clear if you shot the Foreign Secretary, that wouldn't mean that the Prime Minister could no longer make the decision. So you'd have to make that clear. But you'd say in normal circumstances the Prime Minister wouldn't take this thing. Now, the mechanisms of that, you'd have to sit down and discuss. But I think the point is that there are things that nuclear weapon states can do, nuclear armed states can do, that do not affect their ability to conduct deterrence. And in fact, one of the agreements that would enhance stability, and one of the things looking at nuclear command and control, is that nations would agree that they would not attack under any circumstances systems involved in nuclear command and control, even if they got to the point of a conventional conflict between themselves, because of the risk of misinterpretation and escalation as a result of that. So there are a number of things that could be done that are not related specifically to NC3. In fact, in my view, there's very little specifically related to NC3 that would make an overt change to stability.
Well, one place to begin that conversation might just be starting with the definition of NC3, which, as we discovered at the workshop in January, there is no universal or shared there's certain understandings, but there's certainly no conceptual alignment between all the nuclear weapon states. For example, China seems to have a different set of boundaries that go around their NC3 system and how it operates, but there is no explicit, at least as far as I know, and the China experts who are in the room, definition in the Chinese system of its NC3 system as we would view it. So just developing a common understanding of what is meant by the structure and functions of NC3 so that everyone's talking about the same topic cross-culturally, organizationally, technically, might be a useful starting point. And from there, you could develop a taxonomy of possible changes of the kind that you talked about. And there are many of them, I think, that would be starting points without in any way affecting nuclear weapons operations or in any way undermining the ability to deter with nuclear weapons.
I don't disagree with that. I just would not consider it positive to do that under any aegis other than the MPT authorized work and the P5 meetings that fall out from that, because ultimately it is about supporting the role of the MPT and its already existent structures in exercising restraint in managing the relationships between the nuclear and the non-nuclear armed states. And I think if the nuclear weapon states are prepared to have that discussion, that is the arena in which they will have it. One of the reasons why the ban treaty is not positive, in my judgment, to stability and security at this stage is that it is diversionary in terms of effort, in terms of the finite number of individuals and time that will be spent on these issues will, from the governments of nations, the people that really matter. There's only a finite number of people and a finite amount of time. And so it is not helpful to have diverse arenas in which these matters need to be discussed.
There is one in particular that I really wanted to get your opinion on the technical level, on the technical side of things, I should say. It is this ongoing back and forth from those who are in this spectrum of understanding novel artificial intelligence related developments, technical developments, and the assertion by some that and this takes us, I think, more directly back to the conversation about NC3 and deterrence, undetectability, reliability, credibility, etc. This notion that novel AI approaches are going to actually remove the ability for SSBNs to actually be undetectable any longer. And you will get some who will make the argument that that is not far away if it's not already unraveling, and there's others who will say that's just a complete nonsense, and it betrays a lack of understanding of what the laws of physics really at a certain level. Just wanted to hear your take on, and I'm sure you're abreast of these conversations to a greater level of granularity even than I am, but wanted to hear your take on that piece of it in particular.
I'm deeply involved in them, have been since I was responsible for the organisation in the UK that was charged with assessing and forward looking and blue sky thinking about risks and threats to the SSBN. And has been analysing SSBN data since the first patrol in 1968. So it's that group of scientists and experts, and they worked for me. And I've just written a paper for Rory Metcalf at ANU, which they will publish as part of I think it's a paper, actually it's a chapter, which they're publishing, which in to some degree covers this, because one of the other chapters is one of these snake oil salesmen.
Okay.
And I use that phrase not because I am dismissive or my head is firmly in the sand or in any other impermeable medium, but I have been promised by a variety of snake oil salesmen personally, all the organizations for which I have been working for 32 years now, that the oceans are about to become transparent. And a variety of technologies that were going to make it so, whether they be non-acoustic, space-based, laser, drones, so whilst I don't dismiss it, I think, and it is not against the laws of physics that things will become more challenging for the SSBN. The individuals who get involved in these don't come to it almost exclusively, in my judgment, from a pure analytical background. They either hates nuclear weapons and therefore SSBNs and therefore have a point to make, or they're trying to sell something to governments, which is where the snake oil bit comes in. Now, I do know that there is a team led by Roger Bradbury, who's a very smart chap in Australia in matters AI and other stuff, and they're doing a funded, very back to basics analysis of the risks, which for the first time, while they don't have access to the classified side, and this is always the
Yeah.
challenge, will begin to quantify some of these issues. But if you look through the drone swarm, and that's the one that I cover in my chapter of their book, and it's related to a response I made to Basic back in 2016 when they first published the underwater drone swarm is going to make the SSBN super detectable. Is that firstly, there are some flaws in the argument. Secondly, it is the most likely place where AI will make a difference, because what AI is all about is massive processing. And so some of the other issues are not as dependent on AI or quantum computing or whatever the next new gimmick is. But at the very simplistic level, and some may dismiss this as fatuous, but the number of physical objects you need floating around in the middle of the Atlantic to find the elusive SSBN is humongously large. It's of the several million. And that is not only a step change in computing and analytical power, which AI may help, but it's also about control, simple control. And so you say you can quickly calculate that actually it's choke points that matter, not open ocean. And my very simplistic view is if you put 25,000 drones in a choke point, that's going to be quite challenging to do undetected. I will buy 2 trawlers and I'll come through the choke point. Now, I'm not suggesting that will solve the problem, but it's the proponents of these problems always present them as if the deployers of SSBNs just sit there and go, "Oh shit," and do nothing. And I think the problem is that there's throughout the history of conflict, there's been things, and then there've been countermeasures have come up. So it's never as one-sided as they say. So I think whilst it is something that will continually be looked at, and there may be a moment of oh my goodness, but I suspect the oh my goodness moment will first find itself in other warfare and other relationship disciplines long before it becomes the problem for the SSBN. I think it's not about to happen. It may. There's countermeasures to be thought about, which may mitigate some of the step changes. And the final point is we spent a lot of the Cold War because we could, because we had an acoustic advantage until the 2 Americans who sold that acoustic advantage, and frankly, in my view, should have, been made to listen to Justin Bieber 24/7 for the rest of their lives, as opposed to just being put away in solitary confinement in Leavenworth, which is where they are. But until that changed over, we used to go looking, as has been well documented in books like it's mentioned in Hunt for Red October. It's in other books. We used to go looking for SSBNs. Well, when you think about it, that's possibly not a good idea. So prosecuting it's rather like hanging around an ICBM silo with a hand grenade. There's only one reason you're there with a hand grenade next to an ICBM silo. You're probably going to be trying to take out the ICBM silo so it can't launch. The only reason you're hanging around an SSBN is you're going to probably take it out. Now, there are many things that are escalatory in nature in nuclear relationships, but it's hard to come up with one that is more escalatory in nature than looking at the most fundamental bedrock of nuclear deterrence and prosecuting that. So if you look through through a 21st century lens, the other reason that I think, even if the technology is capable of doing it, nations may shy away from engaging in it, is precisely that this is extremely difficult to do in an undetectable way. the chances of a drone swarm having a failed drone that's bobbing around on the surface that someone goes, what's that? And then someone else says, well, that's around the guy who knows where the SSBN says, well, actually, that's a underwater detection drone around where my SSBNs are. What's going on? The practical escalatory risk of that is something that needs to be borne in mind. So while it might be technologically capable, just as it is technologically capable to jam elements of a nuclear command and control system today, it's not done. And the reason it's not done is that that's a precursor to a preemptive attack, or one of the indicators of. The reason that the satellites that track launches are not interfered with is because interfering with them is potentially escalatory. And the reason why I suggest that attacking command and control would be one of the areas that the nuclear armed states would agree they didn't do is because of the misinterpretational escalational risk. And so whilst I'm not oblivious to the issue, I think it is a lot more complicated than we will simply have the capability to do it and then suddenly SSBNs become ineffective or dangerous. So it's a more complex question than a number of the analysts involved.
But what it reminds me of most directly is the conversations that we've had with a variety of folks around and this gets to something we were talking about earlier, around the cyber vulnerabilities associated with NC3 and the conversations around what an adversary might be capable of versus what an adversary might actually be intended upon doing, and knowing what the accordant risks might be.
Philip, you've perfectly realigned my thought process. And what I was leading up to, if I may just jump in, is that the whole of the cyber domain offers risk here.
Yeah.
Not defensive cyber, but offensive cyber. So when people are thinking about offensive cyber activity against a nation state, whether it be at the military, economic, or elsewhere, it is challenging to stability. And the reason I say that is that it is, if you view, I was responsible for nuclear weapon, chemical weapon, biological weapon defense policy in the Ministry of Defense. And when you look at those three, and radiation, but that's a subset, if you like, of nuclear. If you look at those three, chemical weapons and nuclear weapons sort of tended to keep me awake in the daytime. It was biological weapons that kept me awake at night. And the reason I say that is for a nuclear attack and a chemical attack, whilst they're both awful, I know they've happened because they're immediately identifiable. Obviously, immediately identifiable in the sense of a nuclear weapon, but pretty immediately in a chemical weapon. I know where they've happened, and I can usually, whilst it is horrendous for those inside the circle, I can draw a circle around it of effect, and I can mitigate that effect over time within that circle. And pretty much outside that circle, I'm speaking very generically here, you've got a zone that's not affected in the same way. That biological weapons are not the same. You may not know they've happened. There are still scientists I have spoken to who think that the last foot and mouth epidemic in the UK could not have occurred naturally, given the number of start points that it had. Now, wasn't the UK view then and isn't now, but there are people who think that. And these aren't conspiracy theorists, these are thinking epidemiological scientists. So you can't be certain it's happened. You certainly can't draw a boundary around it. And what you mostly can't do is be entirely certain of the unintended consequences of it. And I liken offensive cyber amongst all of those to the biological attack. So if you attack something with offensive cyber and you have decided that you're attacking, point A, whether it goes to position B, C, D, or E depends entirely on whether your analysis of the network that you're attacking is accurate. If it is not, then an attack on a dam in New York could affect the national grid. Your attack on the national grid could affect nuclear command and control. And so your attack needs to be contextualized against the possibilities of what its effect is. And there's nowhere else other than cyber, and cyber accentuated either by AI or quantum computing, that both of those are massive accelerants in the cyber world, that risk the conflation of their activity with preparations for some kind of nuclear activity. And I think the challenge within the states that are experimenting, are getting involved with this arm of national policy and maybe even warfare, is that the people that are currently in charge could perhaps be characterized as what can we do people rather than what should we do people. And that sort of is a similar analogy to the ocean opacity. People are looking at it through the what can or could be done and not adding the layer of what should or shouldn't be done. So I think, in some areas, I think it would naturally assert itself, because the sort of people who would invest the time and money to go and look for an SSBN are those who got them themselves. So it would assert itself as, well, actually, if we do this, what's the risk to us, or what's the risk to stability? My personal concern, it's not a national concern, my personal concern is that level of balancing risk assessment is not necessarily in the cyber domain yet.
Yeah.
Because the assessments of the unintended edge consequences have not yet become a sort of mainstream activity in the super geeky world of cyber. And I don't mean to characterize the individuals that way, but
Sure.
It tends to occur in very classified stovepipes, which prevents other dimensions getting involved in the discussion. And the sort of people who are involved in it probably have spent less time going around the block than other areas.
It's a massive conversation in and of itself, right? And in terms of perhaps most prominently some of the discussion around things like persistent engagement and the inadvertent consequences of having such a forward posture. I will, however, have to restrain myself from going down that path as we've taken up such a great deal of your time. Thank you so much for for an extensive conversation, but thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, okay, my pleasure.
As always, thanks also to our listeners. We'll be back again next week with a new episode of The Fourth Leg. We look forward to you joining us. Be sure to subscribe to the pod in the interim via SoundCloud, or we'll see you on Twitter or on our website. Give us your feedback. Thanks again for listening. We'll talk to you soon.